Hello again. For today's video, I am wearing a hat and a tie. So, today we are discussing Plato's Symposium. Who is Plato? Plato, I'm sure you've heard of, even if you haven't read. Plato was probably and is the most famous philosopher in the Western tradition. And he was a philosopher in the city of Athens, the same place that these playwrights came from. Athens considered itself to be a hub of learning, of art, of philosophy, and Plato really was at the very center of all of this. And he wrote a whole series of dialogues, which are called Plato's Platonic dialogues. And the most famous of those is Plato's Republic, which you may study someday. That's a very long and intricate text that deals with how to structure a society from the ground up. This that we're reading today is much shorter than that. It's the Symposium. It deals with a very different topic, and that is the topic of love. But Plato uses the same techniques and strategies that he uses in many of his other works in the Symposium. So, what does he do exactly? Well, Plato had a teacher, and his name was Socrates. Now, Socrates did not ever write anything down, so his ideas, we don't actually have his physical writing. It didn't come down to us as Plato's did. But he was immortalized by Plato, his most famous student, because Plato would always make Socrates a central character in any of his dialogues. So Plato, instead of simply writing out arguments, line after line after line, in a form of prose or an extended essay, he would bring his ideas to us through dialogue. And as the tradition says, Socrates used to teach in that manner. So Plato was Socrates' pupil, and Socrates would try to teach people in this way. And what Socrates would do is he would use this method, which we now still today call the Socratic method, which is, if I want to convince you of a particular point, or if I want to try and persuade you to see things in my way, instead of shouting a bunch of facts at you and trying to scream you into submission and trying to tell you how stupid you are, instead of just throwing information at you like that, I engage in a dialogue with you. And I ask you a whole bunch of questions. And as I ask you these questions, what I attempt to do is show you that the ideas you hold, the positions that you have, you may not have come to these positions through a sound state of reasoning. You may just have inherited these ideas. You may simply believe them because everybody else around you believes them. And that is not a good reason to believe something, at least not according to Socrates and according to Plato and the long tradition of Western philosophy that has followed from them. So remember that when you read through this dialogue, you'll see a whole bunch of different people giving speeches about love. And at the very end, Socrates comes in and gives his speech about love. But before he gives his speech, he asks a bunch of questions, and he kind of tries to expose some of the flaws in the argument of the other speakers, and then he gives his case. So that's the one thing you need to remember. Another thing to think about is that love and relations between men and women were somewhat different in ancient Athens than they were, or than they are in much of the world today. So you may have heard of the phrase Platonic love, and this was considered to be the highest form of love. And according to Plato, according to Socrates, this was love that two men had for one another, although he goes through all the different types of love that can exist. So sometimes people coming at this from a modern perspective may find that strange or unusual in some way. So I'm just putting that out there so you understand and can read it with that context in mind. Part of reading ancient texts and developing an understanding for them is for us to use historical empathy, right? So historical empathy means when we read something from another time, from another place, from another culture, we try not to fiercely impose our views on how things should be, but we take a step back and say, okay, things were slightly different. People saw the world in a different way. How did they see it? Let me be open to that. I don't have to change my mind about anything that I believe, but I'll just take in what they have to say and say, okay, that's interesting. So there are many different ways that people have approached life and have seen the world through history. And this certainly opens your eyes up to that. It's also, there are some historical characters that come into this. For instance, there's a guy called Alcibiades who appears right at the very end, and he comes in and disrupts the whole party. We don't have to go too much into detail about who he was, but he was an actual figure in ancient Athens, and he was kind of an infamous character. He was known as a bit of a wild guy, a bit of a playboy. So people who would have been reading this would have been familiar with who this historical character was. Other than that, I would recommend, read it carefully, look at each of the speeches that are put forward about love. Much of what they say, even though it had a specific cultural context there, much of the talk about love and the nature of love itself transcends time and place and culture. So even if you find some of the things strange that they're describing here, you can apply the parts about love to your own life, to your own experience. You may find certain things that resonate with you, and maybe see how there are certain parts of love, certain experiences of love that are universal, transcend time and place. Give it a read. Bring your own ideas to it. Bring your own thoughts and analysis. I look forward to reading your responses. Thank you.